The period in Chinese history from the start of the First Opium War in 1839 to the founding of the PRC in 1949 is known as the Century of Humiliation, or Bainian Zhiru. The importance of this period cannot be overstated. In September 2020, New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman, in discussing this period, noted, quote, "Humiliation, in my view, is the most underestimated force in politics and international relations. The poverty of dignity explains so much more behavior than the poverty of money." I wholeheartedly agree. This period was highly damaging to the collective Chinese psyche, as it upended the Chinese sense of superiority and made them second-class citizens in their own land. Certain aspects of this time left deep wounds on the Chinese consciousness that remain fresh today. Now, China had been subdued by foreign powers before, including the Mongols in the 13th century and the Manchus in the 17th century. But these did not have the same impact on the Chinese psyche because Mongols, and to an even greater extent the Manchus, were neighboring tribes who adopted Chinese governing systems, arts, and culture, an example of the sinification I mentioned earlier. The West, often referred to as foreign devils or Yangguizi and ghost people or Guilo in and around Canton, were barbarians from beyond the Pale, which made the defeats even more humiliating for the Chinese. Even worse, rather than adopt Chinese ways, other than an affection for tea and porcelain, Westerners brought merchants and missionaries in an attempt to overthrow and dominate Chinese economy and culture. The primary takeaway for the Chinese during this period was a hard, realist worldview. The strong would prey on the weak to accumulate power and wealth, and because the Chinese had become corrupt and technologically backward, they were easy prey. Therefore, China must become strong and united to prevent such a calamity from ever happening again. As the Chinese-American writer Kaiser Kuo put it, quote, "A ruthless pragmatism, a defensiveness about anything that infringes on national sovereignty, a prickly intolerance for anything that smacks of separatism. These are all things that China learned from its Century of Humiliation." Let's explore this pivotal period in more detail to understand why it played such a pivotal role in shaping China's worldview. Contacts between China and the West predated the Century of Humiliation by millennia. Indirect contact was made over the famed Silk Road, a series of trade routes established and policed by the Han Dynasty starting in about 100 BC. The routes carried a number of goods and included both an overland route through Central Asia and a maritime route from the Chinese coast through Southeast Asia and the subcontinent and up through the Arabian Peninsula. The route was not only a conduit for many goods, but for religion, most notably Buddhism's expansion into East Asia, and for disease as well. Yes, the Black Plague, like COVID-19, originated in China. Despite the fact that Europe was on one end of the road and China was on the other, there was little direct contact, as the road had many junctions and intermediaries, and it was almost unheard of for individuals by land or sea to make the trip all the way from Europe to China. Two notable exceptions were a reported visit by envoys from China, who took 4 years to visit the Roman Emperor Augustus in about 20 BC, and of course the famous Italian adventurer Marco Polo, who visited the Yuan Court in the late 13th century. Some estimates say there may have been several thousand Europeans living in China during the period of Mongol rule, which became known as Pax Mongolica, that put huge parts of Asia under unified control. So Marco Polo may not have been all that unique, but he must have had the best publicist. Maybe we have his Genovese jailer to thank, because when Polo was incarcerated, he took the time to tell his tales to another inmate, who wrote everything down. It doesn't hurt that the name tends to stick with you as well. Beyond the famous summer pool game, I even named our 2 cats Marco and Polo. Again, this contact appeared to have very little effect on China, and more was recorded about these contacts in Europe than in China. The activity of the Europeans in China may not have been noteworthy because of how insignificant the Chinese viewed these visitors from afar. More permanent contacts started in 1601, when the Italian Jesuit priest Matteo Ricci, who had entered Macau in 1582 and established a mission in Guangdong province, was invited to the Ming court as an astronomical advisor to the Ming Emperor Wanli, becoming the first Westerner to enter the Forbidden City. Ricci became an important conduit for cultural exchange, translating Euclid into Chinese and Confucian classics into Latin. In 1602, at the emperor's behest, Ricci produced the first map of the world in Chinese, greatly expanding the Chinese understanding of the world. When he died in 1610, he became the first Westerner permitted to be buried in Beijing. Prior to that time, all Westerners who passed away in China had to be buried in Macau. Because of Ricci's contributions, Jesuits served at the Chinese court for the rest of the Ming Dynasty, which fell in 1644. The Qing court eventually accepted them as well. Emperor Kangxi, one of the greatest emperors in China and the longest reigning at 61 years, employed a number of Westerners at court, including a Jesuit harpsichord teacher. Nevertheless, Kangxi thought of the Westerners as useful but dangerous. As author Maurice Collis wrote, Emperor Kangxi's view was that Europeans were dangerous people who, though possessed with certain material secrets of value, were essentially barbarians, because by guile they would use their mechanical cleverness to overthrow others, and, being without virtue, were not, as all the states in the world should be, convinced that Chinese civilization was the only one. Can you see the impending clash of civilizations coming? An issue facing Western embassies to China was the aforementioned act of prostration known as the kowtow. Western diplomats understood that kowtowing meant accepting the superiority of the Emperor of China over their own monarchs, an act they found unacceptable. The British embassies of George Macartney in 1793 and William Pitt Amherst in 1816 were unsuccessful at negotiating the expansion of trade and interstate relations, partly because kowtowing would mean acknowledging their king as a subject of the emperor. In response to the Macartney mission, the emperor wrote to George III, "You, O king, should simply act in conformity with our wishes by strengthening your loyalty and swearing perpetual obeisance so as to ensure that your country may share the blessings of peace." The British court surely received such high-handedness with offense. Some historians mark the beginning of the fall of the Qing dynasty with the failed Macartney mission. The growing tension between China and the West all comes to a head in my next lecture on the Opium Wars.